Hello, and welcome to episode 33 of Sarastro's Marvel Crisis Protocol painting series. In this episode I'll be painting the Tomb of Dracula terrain pack by Atomic Mass Games. This is a truly spectacular and evocative piece of terrain, with plenty of characterful details that are lots of fun to paint, including a beautiful stained glass window, flickering candles, and a floating book alternative for the tomb itself. As usual, you'll find bookmarks in the video to help navigate to the various sections. There's lots to cover, so let's begin. Assembly of the terrain is pretty straightforward. The main thing to consider is which parts you might want to glue down later to make things easier to paint. I chose to leave off the tomb itself, including the two alternate top sections, as well as the other various accessories such as the treasure chest, decorative axe, the iron fittings for the lanterns, and the hanging draperies. I often like to cover any joins that need gluing later on with a little white tack to protect the surface from the primer, allowing for plastic to plastic contact when the time comes to glue the parts in place. Here I'm mounting all of the pieces I want kept separate for ease of priming. And I'm now just using some texture paste to fill in a couple of small gaps. I'm then priming the whole lot off camera with a black rattle can primer. With that done, we're ready to begin painting. I'm going to start by painting all of the stonework before moving on to the various accessories. So I'm going to begin by overbrushing the whole area with some blue-black, and I might incorporate some random touches of brown or green just to create a bit of organic variation. I'm using a nice large dry brush for this, and maybe something smaller to get into some of the corners. This can cover most of the surface, leaving some of the deeper recesses black. Here I'm freely mixing in some of the black-brown and the green just to create a little variety. I'm also painting the tomb, as well as the window to get a little colour on the areas of lead. I'm now going to lighten things up, firstly with the addition of some neutral grey and dark camo green, followed with some faded green and some khaki for the brighter highlights. Later on, we can also use some more saturated colours to gently tint some of the individual pieces of stone. I'm going to focus on the outer wall for now, and the lighter I go with the mix, the more dry I want the brush to be. Here I'm pausing just to vary the tone of some of the random bricks to create some variation. I'm now mixing in varying amounts of the faded green and khaki and wiping most of the paint off before dry brushing the stonework. You can see I'm pulling the brush in a mostly downward motion, at least for the walls, to recreate the effect of light hitting the textured surface from above. We can also vary some of the individual bricks with a thin glaze, using something a bit more saturated like this green. This is pretty optional, but medieval castles use mortar that often appears lighter than the stonework, so here I'm using quite a light mix to paint the gaps between the bricks to see how things look. I'm now just dirtying things up a little with some random touches of thinned brown. A piece of sponge can also be useful for creating weathered textures like this. We can also create some small patches of lichen with some faded green. And I also chose to add some bits of weathered streaking. I'm now painting the mossy growths, and you could use whatever green tones you like here. I started a little too desaturated, so decided to brush over some pure green to add a little vibrancy. With the outer wall complete, I'm now going to paint the interior using the same approach. You'll often see me using the side of a flat brush to pick out the edges. To add an extra bit of interest, I decided to darken the mortar towards the lower part of the walls, creating a gentle gradation. Next I'm going to paint the tomb itself, initially using the same approach I took with the stonework. I then decided to make it stand out from the surroundings, so I played around with some of the Pro-Acryl transparent paints. Adding some bluish greens and purples helped give the impression of a darker, more marble-ish material. To heighten the look, I then did a nice bit of bright edge highlighting using the lighter tones I used for the bricks. And I'm going further still with some glinting highlights using bright ivory. For the alternative top, which features a floating book, I'm first picking out the metal detailing with some bluish grey tones. I then chose to paint the cover using red, firstly darkened with a little black, then highlighted back up to red. And for the pages I started with some black-brown, then lightened things up with the addition of some khaki. I then decided to age things up quite a bit with some more orangey brown tones. And I added various touches of weathered staining. You can then add some random scribblings to the pages, and I used both black and red for this. For the actual lid of the tomb, we could either leave things as they are, or create a glowing effect as I'm doing here. For this, I'm first using some thinned white oil paint because of how nicely it flows into the recesses, although it will take some time to dry. I'm then simply brushing over some fluorescent green, and you could use whatever colour you like here, before tidying up the surrounding area. These two variants can then simply be dry fitted and swapped out as needed. Next I'm going to paint the draperies, firstly using red darkened down with a little purple. Then highlighting back up to pure red in a couple of stages. I'm after a somewhat worn look here, and often like to use short horizontal strokes to create a bit of texture. It's also worth noting that as a fabric dips into a fold, less light hits the material on the sides. But at the deepest recess where the dip flattens, we'll often find another highlight lurking. I'm now adding a little golden brown to lighten things up for some final highlights. And here I'm just adding a few random spots of dirty weathering. For the fittings, etc., I'm just using some bluish grey colours from the palette left over from painting the stonework. And I'm now gluing them into place. Moving on to the lanterns, I'm first providing an undercoat of pure white. And we can do the same for the other light sources. And then applying some fiery fluorescent tones on top, and you could use whatever fluorescent paints you like for this. I'm starting with a warm yellow, then blending in some more orange tones to create some variation. And I'm doing the same for the brazier and candles, naturally growing more orange towards the hotter end of each flame. For the larger flame on the brazier, I also decided to darken the tip with a touch of black brown mixed with some red. I'm now painting the iron frame of the lanterns using a mix of blue-black and black-brown. Using the side of the brush tip is a pretty easy way to pick out raised details like this. I'm now painting the iron fittings, where I'll be lightening things up with some creamy tones for the highlights. We can also mix in varying amounts of the orange to create some object source lighting. We can be as bold as we like when doing this, then tone things down if necessary. Much of this will be tricky to see once the pieces are in place, so we don't need to be perfectly neat. I'm going pretty intense for some of these edges. And I'm now gluing them into place. Next I'm adding some object source lighting to the wall near the rear lantern. I'm starting with some more muted orange tones mixed using grey and orange in the palette. I'm now adding some bolder, brighter highlights the closer we get to the source. And here I'm shifting into some more reddish tones the further from the lantern we go. Notice the paint is pretty thin here. I'm now improvising with the same range of tones as I paint the brazier. And I'm adding some object source lighting to the nearby wall just as before, except going a little further due to the size of the flame. Hopefully you can get a sense of how I'm using the dilution of the paint and intensity of the tones to build the effect up. Moving on to the axe, I'm first painting the mount using black-brown highlighted up with some light umber. And here I'm also adding some of the orange pigments to show light hitting from the nearby flames. I'm now painting the axe itself using the same range of tones used for the lantern fittings and the brazier. Here we have light hitting the axe from two different nearby light sources, along with the cooler ambient light. I'm using a mix of bright ivory and orange light for the brightest glints. I'm also roughly picking out some of the ornate texture. And here I'm strengthening some of the cooler tones in the areas not hit by the light of the flames. Next I'm going to paint the piles of treasure, firstly using a mix of black brown and dark camo green. I'm then highlighting this up using a mix of golden brown and bright ivory, and a simple bit of dry brushing. I'm now adding some bright ivory and fluorescent orange. And I'm using a pure mix of the bright ivory and orange to add a few discreet glints. For the chest, I'm using mainly black brown and light umber for the wood. And we can use the same bluish grey tones used earlier for the metalwork. I'm now returning to the treasure, where I've chosen to use some Athonian Camo Shade and Agrax Earthshade to bring back a little depth. And I decided to pick out this amulet using red and some glinting pink highlights. Moving on to the candelabra, I initially used the same range of colours that I used for the treasure. I then decided I want a richer, more brassy tone, so I had a play with some transparent brown and some transparent orange. This just gives me a richer, more saturated tone to highlight up from. We can then use a warmish grey for the candles. Glowing warmer and brighter towards the top. And here I'm adding a few touches of a more bluish grey to some of the shadows. I'm also painting the two small clusters of candles that can be freely placed anywhere. And I'm now gluing the candelabra into place. Finally, before moving on to the window, I'm painting the urn, where I'm going with a pretty dark look and some concentrated, more orangey highlight towards the top. And here I'm just picking out a few non-metallic metal highlights on the blade of this axe. The last main thing to paint is the stained glass window. For that, I want to first paint all of the glass in white so we can achieve the kind of values that create the impression of light passing through. I first used white oil paint for this because it flows so nicely, and I didn't bother trying to avoid the smaller pieces of lead. For subsequent layers I switched to acrylic paint for the faster drying times, and I'm now working with a bit more care in between the lines. We can then tidy up the lead strips a little before adding some colour. Here I once again chose to try out the Pro-Acryl transparent colours, but any suitably thinned paint would be fine. I'm first mixing a couple of different hues of red with the addition of some purple and orange, just to create some variation. I'm then painting the individual segments of Dracula's armour, alternating the slightly different hues to create interest. I don't need the coverage to be especially even here. I'm now mixing some blue and black for the rest of the outfit. And here I'm adding some purple for the cloak. I'm now freely mixing blue, black, purple and green to paint the lower sections of the window to represent the ground Dracula is standing upon. For the patches of sky behind Dracula, I'm simply thinning the colour right down to create some much paler hues. I imagine this to be a silvery moon. And I'm using a mix of yellow and white for the surrounding panes. And here I'm just adding a touch of purple to create some variation. For Dracula's skin, I chose to use some faded green. I'm now just reinforcing the definition of some of the lead strips. And here I'm mixing some white into the transparent tones and adding a few glinting highlights to the glass. I'm also adding a few highlights to the frame. We can then add some weathering according to taste. And here I chose to create the impression of light shining through the glass onto the stone surround. We can mix the colours used for the glass into some grey tones to bring up the values here. I'm now gluing the window into place. And to create a more glassy looking finish, I chose to apply some gloss varnish, doing my best to avoid the lead strips. Here I chose to play with throwing some coloured light onto the ground, and I switched back and forth between bringing up the values with some additional dry brushing and applying some thinned colours on top. I'm now finishing things off by picking out a few final details. And this completes the Tomb of Dracula. Thank you for joining me. I do hope you have enjoyed the episode. As usual, you can find product lists in the video description, along with links to all of the places I can be found online, including the various social media and music platforms, as well as my Patreon page if you'd like to help support what I do. As always, my sincerest thanks go to my amazing patrons for funding this work. I simply couldn't do it without them. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures for Marvel Crisis Protocol. Happy painting!